Our next speaker is Shikha Jain. Shikha Jain, the director of Drona, has wide experience in cultural heritage ranging from representation at the UNESCO World Heritage Committee meetings for Ministry of Culture to planning and implementation of more than 40 conservation and museum projects across India. She's also a UNESCO consultant, has received HUDCO awards for her projects, and her work on Jaipur is also documented as Best Practice Projects by NIUA in 2015. She's a visiting faculty for urban conservation in the Department of Urban Planning, SPA, Delhi, and UNESCO C2C visiting fellow at Dehradun. She has authored and edited several publications on the cultural heritage of India. Welcome, Shikha.
Very good evening to everyone. I'm going to give a brief overview of my work and my profession, which is actually really my hobby. And it was sometime when I was doing my architecture in 4th year that I became inclined towards historic architecture, looking at history and heritage, and really thought that that's the space where I want to work in. And that's when I selected my dissertation topic, Havelis in Rajasthan, which was later on also became my PhD and finally got published in a book. And at the same time, I also looked at my PhD, at my thesis work, which was on Ghat Ki Guni. I'm going to show you a bit of that. And that's what I tell architecture students, that if they start thinking and if they look at certain passion projects during their study in architecture, it somehow may build up into something that they really want to do throughout life. It was after my PhD in 2004 that I established Drona, which is the organization, development and research organization for nature, arts and heritage. And the whole idea behind this organization was that it needs to be interdisciplinary. Though I'm an architect specializing in conservation, but I don't feel that I can work alone. It has to be teamwork and it has to be interdisciplinary in nature. So I don't think the discipline on its own can sustain. And that's why the whole idea behind Drona is that you need to work with other professions. And whatever approach we have towards our conservation or heritage projects, it needs to be holistic. It needs to integrate nature, culture, and community together as a whole. And incidentally, the name Drona comes from, because it's registered in Gurgaon, and which is Dronacharya's Gaon. So it's just sort of an acronym which also links to the place that we are in. I've structured my presentation as was, some topics suggested by Shimul. And it just explains what I like to do, which is teaching, writing, practice. So I'm just going to shuffle the slides between these few aspects that I deal with. I like teaching, that is, essential. I can't survive without teaching. So even if I'm practicing or writing, I have to get back to teaching, or even if it's my office, I look at all the people who are working with me as part of my team who I'm training all the time. And I love teaching architecture students. But most of all, I really like doing training programs for the government officials, because we are working on heritage buildings. 90% of those heritage structures are with the government officials, and I feel it's most important to sensitize them, because that's where we are really losing out on most of our historic heritage because of the lack of understanding that is there with the government officials. So there are several, besides teaching in classes, what I really prefer doing is field demonstrations, and this is a workshop that we did in Udaipur where we had CPWD, DMRC, and a lot of other government organizations for the training. So that's really my long-term target. It's really looking at people who are practicing and are on field to get them sensitized towards conservation. And writing is again a part of what I practice. Whatever I'm working on or researching needs to be documented in some ways. So whichever project we are working on, whether it shapes into an article or a book form, and it's not only our article. We started when Drona was started in 2004. We also simultaneously started a publication Context, which actually showcases conservation, energy efficient design, community related projects all across India. So that is a journal, annual journal that has been, is being published by Drona since last 10 years. Besides the other books that that I've been writing about, which relate to my projects. What I mentioned about the community, culture, and nature coming together, and this was my bachelor's thesis project, Ghat Ki Guni, on the outskirts of Jaipur. It's set within a valley, has 52 structures which were unprotected at that time in 91 when I took it up for my thesis. And I didn't realize that my thesis is going to turn into a lifetime project. In 95, there was an architectural competition announced for this, and I participated. I was one of the winners. But again, the project was shelved. Like any government project, it was shelved for some time. And then it again reappeared, and the government came up with an expression of interest. I applied, and we got this project. But it was a very complex project, because this 2.5 kilometer of stretch was located on the Jaipur-Agra highway. And you had these 52 structures that you see down below in the valley, which actually were getting damaged because of the highway traffic, the trucks that went through it. So the major component of this project was really looking at an alternate highway route, which had actually to go through the one of the hillocks on the sides. About 50 meters of tunnel permission was required, and that was through the Ministry of Environment, because these are protected hills. So the whole process of getting these structures, 52 structures, protected, then looking at their conservation, looking at the natural component, also proposing adventure trails in this particular area, the condition of this particular facade, looking at development models for it, conserving it, interviewing the locals who own the buildings out here and understanding what they would like to do, and rejuvenating it with heritage walks once certain buildings were conserved. It's still not complete. The third component of the project is still pending, and like I said, because it's a government project, even though we push, and besides Drona, we have a foundation that does the outreach programs such as this Heritage Walk. So we try to keep the project alive even if it is closed in government files, and we wait till it reappears again so that there is a continuity and the locals there are still sustaining it in some way. This is another one. I mean, it's rare for conservation architects to actually get private projects. I mean, those are really very good for us compared to the way government works in terms of tendering, going for the lowest tender, which I know as architects you would be knowing very well. It's there in architectural practice too. But this is one of the projects where we have a private client who's one of the royal family, descendant of Udaipur family. And in this particular project, what I'm trying to say is, expresses the approach that we take from planning to phased implementation. So if in a situation like this where you have a palace, which is one of the largest palace in entire India, about 200,000 square foot of space, which is supposed to be converted into a museum, partly running and partly to be revived. There are, complete rooms which are closed. We prepared a comprehensive conservation management plan, applied for funding through the Getty Foundation, and looked at establishing a conservation policy which doesn't only think of tangible elements such as reviving or conserving the historic fabric, but also linking the locals, the traditions, like the Nagarchi that you see, whose Nagara was also repaired, and now he's back into the palace beating the drums there. Right down to the final execution of the museum galleries inside. So even though I've been with this project for the last almost 10 years, getting funding for the project, executing, doing various conservation plans, getting the whole team together, and looking at the entire palace, it's still only 20% of the work done. And similar to what I explained, the previous Ghat Ki Guni project and this particular one, these are projects that become lifetime commitment for us. So it's not that it's not like an architectural building that I design, which is completed and I get pleasure of looking at it and then I move on to the next. that's the difference I find in conservation. In conservation, whichever area I take or I start working on becomes like a lifetime commitment. I get engaged with the locals, the stakeholders, and then we need to really ensure that it is being sustained long term. Since Shimul asked, I'm talking also about the governmental advisory positions. Like I said, the main challenge that I really face is working with the government. So we got an opportunity. I was the member secretary for Advisory Committee on World Heritage for the Ministry of Culture. For 4 years, when India was elected as a World Heritage Committee members, I had the opportunity to represent the country and speak in UNESCO on the World Heritage Committee decisions on the 40 selected sites across the world, as well as the biggest challenge was actually changing the guidelines, because most of the UNESCO guidelines are Eurocentric. So to really look at the drafts and the text and make it more oriented towards the East and put in the Indian perspective, that was the main challenge. It's not just inscribing sites on World Heritage List, but actually to change the operational guidelines, which are always tuned towards a very Eurocentric approach. So those were some of the challenges that were there, which I was really happy that I got the chance to contribute in some way towards the country. Getting the sites inscribed on World Heritage was one of the biggest achievements, to get 6 hill forts inscribed as a single site in one go for my native state, Rajasthan. But the challenge, of course, is not just getting it inscribed. It's also looking at international level impact and national level impact, looking at heritage legislation, policies, and the UNESCO impact on South Asia and South Asian cities where I interacted with Singapore, Chiang Mai, and other countries like Myanmar, who I'm now advising on UNESCO matters because of my experience of the World Heritage Committee. But the main challenges that still remain, because I like to oscillate between practice, research, and writing all the time, and I just feel incomplete if I'm just doing one of it. So it's unless I mix it together and I put the research into practice or teach what I'm practicing, I just feel totally incomplete. But the main challenges I face is looking at how we translate whatever, such as UNESCO guidelines at the global level, to right down to the local ground level, to apply research and theory into actual practice, because that's always a challenge with government project. We have supplemented it with research components and research projects, and yet when we advise them on policy matters and all, there are always challenges. Dealing with the government sector for changes in policy and practice, and promoting traditional practices and achieving quality on site in these works. So just as an example, where we got the Jantar Mantar Jaipur inscribed on the World Heritage List, it was going to Brasilia, talking in the World Heritage Committee, convincing them and getting the site inscribed. But then coming back to the ground, looking at the management plan and seeing how it is being implemented, looking at aspects such as signage that need to be integrated with local stone craftsmanship, looking at socioeconomic viability of whatever projects we are doing, getting an interpretation center installed there, getting all the historic instruments which were lying locked by the government to get them to exhibit these, and also to link it with the crafts walk, heritage walks in the town, and to get everybody involved, including differently able students. Like we got this walk done through a visually impaired intern that we have in our office. So it's not just looking at the tangible, but linking the tangible, intangible from global to the local level, and from planning to right down to the ground level. And it's an exercise that is never complete. There are always issues, and there are always unachieved objectives that remain. Another challenge is in impact. I especially use this particular example because I found that there are places where I was talking, whether it was Smart City Forum in Barcelona or in India, but I would probably be the only woman in the entire panel. And it also happened that once in a program in Udaipur Smart City, I realized that in the entire program, which had 5 panel sessions, I was the only woman. And they had actually placed me right at the end or in the last panel. And I finally had to mention it when I came to speak. And in the end, I said, I mean, what happened to ladies first? So this is, I'm just mentioning because the gender issue and the invisibility issue is something that we are all dealing with all the time. And a lot of times in practice, we find that it's, you know, you are the single woman and you have to speak, otherwise you're just invisible. Also, understanding various culture and communicating in various languages, that remains a challenge. And of course, the biggest challenge on site, this is an example of the chopper in Jaipur that we were working with. And they were, what you see is those semi-covered structures. The local association there, they showed us this historic picture and they said, see, we had these, you know, units before, so why don't you give us permanent units? They went to the government and mentioned this, and the government official came and, like, the principal secretary asked me, he said, why don't you design something? Can we do it permanent? I said, no, it's historic. In this historic image, you can see it's a permanent structure, and that's what we will design. So we worked with the local associations. We found out how many vendors, what they sell, everything. We designed the structure for them, and we had a unit that they could lock and go back in the evening. And, you know, we had a sample of the unit prepared for them to look at. And then, I just got a call. We even got it sanctioned from the Ministry of Urban Development. The budget was sanctioned. It was supposed to be implemented. And then suddenly I got a call from the mayor of Jaipur saying, you know, you'll be happy to know we have removed all these vendors from the chopper. Now it's all clean. Now give me a design with nice landscape area. So this was a real shock for me, and I tried convincing her, but she said, no, the shopkeepers behind, which you see out, you know, the shopkeepers behind, they went to her and they said, oh, if these structures come, our shops are going to be blocked. And it's not that these shops are not blocked, even historically you can see, but that is the biggest challenge that we face, that there are so many voices to the community. So though we are trying to work with culture, nature, and community, but when it comes to community, it's not just one single voice. And a lot of time we face such a situation where, you know, we design certain things and we want to take up certain things, but because of these issues or this lack of collective voice of the community, we are not able to do it. And in this case, then finally the vendors asked me for the design because they were located somewhere else. We gave them the design of the unit, which hopefully they utilized. We also did a landscape design in a manner that the vendors could still come back and be there, because that's really, you know, our living historic cities. We can't really live without these intangible values and the informal sector in our country. And that's where I end, because I'm still continuing with this challenge of, you know, conflicting aspirations and conservation approach that we practice. Thank you.